G'day. Now I'm often asked for more detail on the splitter that I run on my NB turbo track car here. So I thought today would be a perfect opportunity to take you through a bit more detail on the splitter I run on the car now, how it's mounted, how I built it, but also a bit of history on some of the other splitters I've used over the past and why I ended up with the splitter that I have now, which is this guy here. I guess starting firstly with some of the past, some of the history. I often would use this aluminium composite panel stuff. It's a cord plastic with alloy sheeting either side of it. And this worked quite well. It's relatively lightweight, easy to cut, albeit not super strong, which meant you had to support it quite well to the car, or it just couldn't be too big. You couldn't go too crazy huge with that stuff unless you kind of knew how to mount it properly. Often it was just sort of aluminium angle or aluminium box tube, and you'd find somewhere on the chassis to bolt it to, usually the chassis rails and then maybe the subframe somewhere. Nothing too elaborate, easy to cut. You can use an angle grinder or a jigsaw, that sort of thing, really easy to work with. And it worked. It's quite thin at about 6mm, so ideally you'd want something a little bit thicker. It can kind of look a bit aggressive and sharp, and people get a little bit concerned about that, particularly tech inspections, scrutineers, they'll go over it and go, oh, that's a bit sharp. So it was good, but it wasn't perfect. More recently, I've moved to the Plywood Splitter, and this is, I think, 9mm, maybe 12mm thick. I bought a full 1200 by 2400 sheet of this to be able to get a splitter this size. This is pretty large for an MX-5, and it was expensive. It's Baltic birch ply, not just sort of generic Bunnings ply. Bunnings ply is crap. It's bent and cheap quality. Baltic birch is generally a bit lighter and also a bit stronger, but expensive. That sheet, or a full sheet to cut this out, was $200 almost. So not cheap ply. I think overseas you get it a lot cheaper. Unfortunately here in Australia, we're not that lucky. The shape I just kind of made up myself. Just, you look at other cars that are fast and you go, hey, they've got cool splitter shapes, I'll try and do something similar. So it's, you know, I've got nothing to base it on. I've just done what I could. There's cutouts here for the wheel to be able to turn, and that sort of stuff's very easy to do. Once you've got this kind of roughly shaped correctly, you can simply bolt it up to your car, and then you start to turn the wheel, and if it hits something, you just cut a little bit more out until it all fits well. I've painted it in a white oil-based paint to try and keep moisture absorption down and keep moisture and water out of it, so if I do drive it on a wet day or something, it doesn't get all soggy and wear out the wood prematurely. But it seems to sort of hold up to weather pretty well. It's more likely to get scuffed, as you can see up here. Also on this underside, obviously you can see the two knacker ducts I use for brake ducts. I don't know if they're perfect, don't know if they work all that well, but it was something I wanted to try. Very easy to do. I actually just marked out the shape here, got my router and sort of routed out the shape so they sit flush, so they kind of sit quite nice and flush. And then these are designed by me in CAD and 3D printed, so really cheap little vent DIY sort of setup, nothing too glamorous here. On the sides, so here and also on the other side there, I've got some skid blocks. These are Delrin or acetal that have been bolted in, and it's just so that when you go hook through a corner, the edges of the splitter, or you hook over even a curb or something, the edges of the splitter aren't grinding on the dirt. Instead, these are kind of a waste item, and after a few events you can swap them out. They just unbolt. And other than that, there's not a whole lot else under here other than a whole heap of bolts. But I'll take you to the top side of the splitter and I'll show you why they're all there. So if we lie this fella down, the first thing I'll talk about is the end fences here. I have nothing to base the shape on. I just made it up. I just thought it looked cool. Kind of took some inspiration from other more popular and fast track cars and made up my own shape. And then it's just some aluminium angle, 3 pieces of aluminium angle along here to bolt in and up from the bottom into that angle. That's what fixes that in place. It's nice and sturdy, it doesn't wobble or damage. Across the top and at the sort of most extreme points of the splitter, I've got some hooks or small holes to affix connections to support the most extreme areas of the splitter, the parts that are furthest from the mounting points, and you know these are going to have some give if they weren't supported. So I've got a mount at each furthest outside point, and then 2 at the front here where we get a lot of frontal load. You've got weather stripping, just some sort of foam rubber type stick-on stuff all along the front here, and that's because I run a kind of air dam that sits up against that, comes up to the front bumper, and that's this stuff here. It's a plastic garden edging, literally from Bunnings. You know, you buy a big roll for, I don't know, 50 bucks, 20 bucks, whatever. Bunnings is our kind of main hardware shop here in Australia. So that edging literally just sits up against this, and then it bolts into the bumper with a bunch of riv nuts, nothing too glamorous. Behind this, everything else in the sort of the white area is behind the bumper outside of the airflow. So you can obviously see the top of the 2 knacker ducts. They're a 3-inch outlet, but more critically than that is the 2 mounting pins. So I wanted to try my best to make this a relatively quick release splitter, and that's not exactly easy because it also needs to be strong and be secured to the car. But the fact of the matter is this splitter has to come off to be able to get the car onto my trailer, so I'm taking it on and off every track event. As such, I sort of came up with this pin design. So it's a solid aluminium rod with a point ground into it. It's welded to some plates that are then bolted pretty sturdily to the splitter itself, and those pins then slide into receptacles that are on the car. I've got a couple of bits of aluminium angle here to give everything strength and kind of just figure it can't hurt. The ply has a little bit of flex in it, and hopefully this will alleviate some of that over that such wide span. And then there's also a piece of tube along the back here doing the same thing. It's literally just there to add a bit of strength and rigidity. Other than that, there's really not much else to say here. At the back, I've got a section that slots into some C channel on the body of the car at the bottom of the subframe, and again, that's sort of the rear mounting point. So I've got a rear mounting point, the 2 main supports, they're the key parts that do most of the work, and then there's the 4 small extremity points that kind of keep the splitter from twisting and suffering under load. Now, how does that all relate to the car? Well, let me show you. On the car itself, you can see here are my turnbuckle style. They're on a wire. They're hooked up to the chassis underneath the body panel here, so you don't actually see the mounting point. It comes through the bumper. That attaches to the splitter at the outermost edge. The splitter protrudes past the front wheel edge by, I don't know, 3 or 4 inches or something, maybe 3 inches. So it is a bit aggressive. Then I've got 2 that come out from the radiator area, and then they're attached to the chassis up above there. On the bumper, you'll see I've actually got an extension piece here from the standard MD bumper to give it a sort of a dam in front of the front wheels, and obviously that in theory improves aero drag and things. Rather than having that front wheel exposed, it's sort of encouraging air to flow around the front wheel. As such, I've got M6 riv nuts along here, and that's what this air dam affixes to. And this air dam doesn't attach to the splitter, it just literally sits on top and rests up against that sort of foam rubber stripping. And then underneath is the fixing point. That's where our pin on the splitter slides into. And then it's also locked in place. There's holes here, and I have a pin that slides in to stop it from obviously sliding out. But fundamentally, that's the splitter in general. The whole setup onto the car. It's simple, right? There's nothing overly elaborate or glamorous here. It's all just DIY stuff. Really, it just takes time. You fluff about trying to work out how to make this work, you put things together, and eventually you end up with a setup that kind of works. It handles 240 kilometers an hour at Phillip Island going down the main straight, so I know this is sturdy and strong, it holds up fine. So it's, yeah, there's no fancy materials, it's all relatively accessible stuff you can buy from your XYZ generic hardware store. You don't need to go anywhere special. We don't need to use any special parts like carbon fibers or any fancy materials. It's just plywood, some aluminium strip, and some bolts. I just use M6 for most things because it's really accessible here in Australia. Every bolt on the MX-5 is pretty much an M6 bolt, so it's really good to use that. And at least if you need a bolt for something, you've always got some somewhere. So if you want these ducts, also I'm pretty sure I've shared the file for that on Thingiverse, so I'll include a link in the description below, but nonetheless check out Thingiverse. I've got those on there. They're a 3-inch duct to NACA style. You could use it for in-car vents or something. It doesn't have to be brake ducts, but yeah. Anyway, that's a tour of the splitter. I hope you enjoy, and I hope that was helpful and insightful. And if you make a splitter of your own, maybe this sort of takes you along for the ride, gives you a bit of an idea on what you can do. Cheers. Thanks for watching. See ya.